The downside of democracy. Throughout the history of man, there have been two basic forms of public government. One, rule by the elite, a monarchy, aristocracy, oligarchy. And two, rule by the people, democracy. The three basic forms of democracy are: 1, direct democracy, where the general public vote on every issue of law and governance. Number 2, representative democracy, also known as parliamentary democracy, where the representatives are elected by the public and in turn vote on every issue of law and governance. And number 3, presidential democracy, also known as authoritarian democracy, where an individual is elected by the public and in turn establishes every law and issues of governance. At the heart of the idea of democracy is the doctrine of popular sovereignty. Popular sovereignty simply means that the majority of the voting public knows what is best for everyone else. But, as the saying goes, democracy is two wolves and a lamb voting on what to eat for lunch. In other words, democracy is great as long as you share the same sentiment as the majority. Upon exiting the United States of America Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin was approached by a group of citizens asking what sort of government the delegates had created. His answer was, "A republic, if you can keep it." A republic simply means a form of government in which the country is considered a public matter. Therefore, the framers of the American system of federal government were elevating the role of public participation by implementing a representative form of democracy with checks and balances. The founding fathers of this fledgling form of federal administration knew that allowing the general public to direct the creation of laws that would govern them was a risky business. Therefore, they provided a set of foundational principles known as the Constitution that gave a framework for public lawmaking, with the hope that this new experimental process would ultimately be governed by people who were themselves governed by biblical absolutes. In reality, the process of democracy is only played out on the surface of society, while the brute forces of dirty politics form the undercurrent that ultimately makes laws and provides governance. Today it is very popular for various groups to vehemently express their views in an attempt to gain public acceptance and eventually be presented as the majority view. In some cases, a majority in volume can constitute a majority of opinion, as the screams of the minority drowned out their opposition. We see that the expression of the popular will can create a cacophony of discordant voices, leaving many baffled about the true meaning of majority rule. In far too many places around the world today, the expression of popular will is nothing more than the unleashing of personal passion that have little, if any, concern for the good of the whole of society. It can even create and promote genocidal policies toward those without a voice in the democratic process. The sad end of democracy is anarchy, where rival factions splinter the fabric of society in order to gain their own selfish means. Ultimately, the democratic process turns into nothing but a horrible form of tyranny that is initiated and enforced by the majority. In order for democracy to work, you must have a minimum of 3 key ingredients. Number 1, a willingness to do what is right. Number 2, a resignation to the final outcome of the democratic process. And number 3, a wide public access to unbiased knowledge of the related facts and circumstances about which the democratic process is going to consider. Sadly, today we live in a world filled with toxic news agencies who serve up their opinion as replacement for information. Rather than informing the public, they seem totally focused on shaping public opinion. Therefore, the modern public is caught in a quagmire of fake news, doctored photos and videos, and conspiracy mania. In this world of information overload, sound bites replace sound logic, and screaming slogans replaces open dialogue and meaningful debate. In the midst of all this confusion, people seem to be quite happy to make resolute decisions based on nothing more than a cartoon character representation of some very complicated issues. Recently, there has emerged a third form of social government. Number 3, rule by the individual. Evolving from the parent thought of popular will, it is built on the foundational principles of personal sovereignty and personal truth. Although it spreads fastest in the fertile soil of the anarchist movement, it's finding root within mainstream society. In this hostile world of violently competing agendas, common courtesy is trampled under the feet of contending opponents. This is where the creed of survival of the fittest is the guiding motivation that enables social Darwinism. Therefore, this type of Darwinian-style democracy paves a slippery slope for a society to plunge ever downward. The Bible tells us in Proverbs 14:12 that ultimately democracy, self-determination, is the agent of societal and personal destruction. On a placard outside of Auschwitz, George Santayana's famous quote is a powerful reminder that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. The biblical narrative of the nation of Israel is a great place to start when it comes to gaining both a historical perspective and prophetic insight for the times in which we live. The nation of Israel was founded on a new type of public government that was based on the law of God. This allowed each person to rule their own life according to one divine standard. The unifying fact was not the people, but the laws God had given them to follow. The book of Joshua closes with this final exhortation. Now therefore, fear the Lord, serve him in sincerity and in truth, and put away the gods which your fathers served on the other side of the river and in Egypt. Serve the Lord. And if it seems evil to you to serve the Lord, choose for yourself this day whom you will serve, whether the gods which your fathers served that were on the other side of the river, or the gods of the Amorites, in whose land you dwell. But as for me and my house, we will serve the Lord. The chapter then closes by stating, And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua, and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, and which had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel. Unfortunately, without the guiding hands of these godly leaders, the nation of Israel soon drifted away and became like the nations around them. We read in Genesis chapter 2, verse 10, When all the generation had been gathered to their fathers, another generation arose after them who did not know the Lord, nor the work which he had done in Israel. Then the children of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord and served the Baals. Basically, Israel ignored the God that had rescued them from the bondage in Egypt and became servants themselves of the gods of the Canaanites. As you review the book of Judges, you are constantly struck by the images of people who are so bent on following after their own desires that they repeatedly find themselves ensnared by their appetites and subsequently ensnared by their enemies. By chapter 17, we are told, In those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did which was right in his own eyes. Thus, for the remainder of the book of Judges, you will read of the increasing depravity of a nation that has no room for the counsel nor correction of God. Here, I believe, we have a perfect picture of the disaster of democracy when the people have lost their moral compass. We now live in an age when universally it can be said, without fear of contradiction, that there arose another generation after them which knew not the Lord, that is, the God of the Bible, and every man did that which was right in his own eyes. Therefore, we now see the distress, disease, demise, and destruction of modern society that was promised by God for Israel if they were not faithful to follow his commandments. But let's be fair. Rebellion against God is an endemic problem that has existed throughout the history of mankind. Before the first global judgment by God, the condition of the world at that time sounds a lot like it could have been written about today. In Genesis chapter 6, we read, "The earth also was corrupt before God, and the earth was filled with violence. So God looked upon the earth, and indeed it was corrupt, for all flesh had corrupted their way on the earth. And God said to Noah, The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with violence throughout them, and behold, I will destroy them with the earth." Jesus gave us an important end times prophetic insight when he said in Luke chapter 17, "As it was in the days of Noah, so shall it be in the days of the Son of Man." Jesus goes on to say in verse 7 of chapter 17, "And shall God not avenge his own elect, who cry out day and night to him, though he bears long with them? I tell you that he will avenge them speedily. Nevertheless, when the Son of Man comes, will he really find faith on the earth?" Clearly, Jesus was predicting a predominantly corrupt world that would be hostile to the gospel. Sounds like today, doesn't it? If we track back to the seminal moment of the nation of Israel and their subsequent descent into their destructive behavior, we can see an important predecessor influence. Joshua 24, verse 31, "And Israel served the Lord all the days of Joshua and all the days of the elders that outlived Joshua, and which had known all the works of the Lord that he had done for Israel." Simply put, the heart of man's problem is in the heart of man. If man's heart is turned toward God, then righteousness reigns. But if man's heart turns away from God, then the wages of sin are paid in full. To counterbalance a world gone mad, Jesus told his disciples in Matthew chapter 5, "You are the salt of the earth, but if the salt loses its flavor, how shall it be seasoned? It is then good for nothing but to be thrown out and trampled underfoot. You are the light of the world. A city that is set on a hill cannot be hidden. Nor do they light a lamp and put it under a basket, but on a lampstand, and it gives light to all who are in the house. Let your light so shine before men that they may see your good works and glorify your Father which is in heaven." The prevention of putrefaction is purification. Darkness cannot survive where light exists. Providing these purification influences should be the primary function of the church today. The first century followers of Jesus faced a predominantly hedonistic society which was not too dissimilar to what we see today. Confronted by many different pagan cultures, Greek philosophies, political corruption, and Roman excess, the early church was focused on its prime objective, which was to go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. The early church did not form an army, promote a political party, or in any way dilute their efforts to fully carry out their Great Commission. If you want to see change in the world around you, start with good news that goes straight to the heart. At the end of the Apostle Paul's life, he was in prison where he was surrounded with the reality of his own impending death. Injustice, social chaos, and political corruption were everywhere. Yet, in the midst of these terrible times, he penned his last letter to Timothy, from which we should get some direction on our best way forward. To Timothy chapter 4, Paul writes, "I charge you therefore before God and the Lord Jesus Christ, who will judge the living and the dead at his appearing and his kingdom. Preach the word. Be ready in season and out of season. Convince, rebuke, exhort with all long-suffering and teaching. For the time will come when they will not endure sound doctrine, but according to their own desires, because they have itching ears, they will heap up for themselves teachers, and they will turn their ears away from the truth and be turned aside to fables. But you be watchful in all things, endure affliction, Do the work of an evangelist. Fulfill your ministry. May God bless, direct, and comfort all of you.